Chapter 1. An unexpected visitor, Hercule Poirot, lay nestled in his bed, his small frame swaddled in a thick woolen blanket. The fire in the grate crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. But the great detective scarcely noticed. His usually sharp mind, renowned for its precision, felt dulled by the weight of a persistent ailment. At his side, Captain Arthur Hastings sat in a worn armchair, leafing through the morning's newspaper, reading snippets aloud in an effort to lift Poirot's spirits. "Here's an interesting one, Poirot," Hastings said, clearing his throat. "Stock markets show signs of recovery. Experts optimistic for the coming year. Rather good news, don't you think?" Poirot's mustache twitched as he cracked open one eye, fixing his friend with a look of mild exasperation. "My dear Hastings," he murmured, his voice faint but pointed, "you know how I detest unnecessary noise when I am unwell. The affairs of the world can manage without my attention for a single day." Hastings lowered the paper, his expression softening with concern. "You really are under the weather, old chap. That cold of yours isn't letting up." Poirot sighed, a touch theatrically, adjusting his pillows with deliberate care. "Hey, it is most vexing, Hastings. I have taken my medicine, and now I must rest. The little gray cells, they cannot perform their brilliance when the body is in revolt." He closed his eyes, signaling the end of the conversation. But at that moment, a soft knock sounded at the door. It creaked open, revealing the housemaid, her figure hesitant in the dim light. "Sir," she said, addressing Poirot, "there's a gentleman outside who wishes to see you. He says it's urgent." Pugh's brow furrowed slightly, but he did not open his eyes. "Tell him Hercule's indisposed," he replied, waving a dismissive hand. The maid hesitated. He seemed rather anxious or not. "My dear girl, I am unwell," Poirot said, shifting slightly beneath his blanket. "I do not entertain guests when I am on my sick bed." Hastings, however, Hatcherson from his chair and was already moving toward the door. "I'll go and see what he wants." Poirot exhaled with exaggerated patience. Hastings, always eager, top-played the role of the gallant Englishman very well, but do not let him disturb more necessarily. Hastings stepped out into the hallway and followed the maid to the sitting room. As he entered, his eyes fell upon a man pacing restlessly near the fireplace. He was well dressed, wearing a dark gray overcoat over a tailored suit butt. His movements were tense and his fingers drummed nervously against his lapel. Upon hearing Hastings' approach, the man turned abruptly. His face was pale, his blue eyes flickering with an anxious energy. "You must be Captain Hastings," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "I must speak with Mr. Poirot at once. My name is Charles Kendish, and I have come on a most desperate errand." Hastings extended a hand in greeting, though he regarded the man with a cautious curiosity. "Mr. Kendish, Pooh, is unwell at the moment. I'm afraid he's not seeing anyone today." Charles's expression faltered. What he began, then stopped. He took deep breath, composing himself. "I beg you, Captain, I would not have come unless it were absolutely necessary. 'Tis a matter of grave urgency." Hastings gestured toward an armchair. "Please have a seat. Tell me how it's happened. I assure you, if Poirot can be of assistance, I will let him know." Charles hesitated for a moment. Before dropping into the chair, he ran a hand through his dark hair, visibly struggling to contain his distress. "My uncle has been murdered," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Hastings straightened. "Murdered?" Charles nodded. "Yes, sir, Reginald Kendish. He was shot in his study last night." Hastings frowned, feeling a familiar stirring of intrigue, despite the grim circumstance. "See, and why do you seek Poirot's help?" Charles let out a shaky breath back. "'Cause I don't trust the local authorities to solve this. They'll see it as a simple burglary gone wrong. But, it isn't. My uncle was not the sort of man to fall victim to random violence, so Mion wanted him dead." Hastings studied the man before him. There was something deeply It's unsettling in his manner, something more than mere grief. You seem convinced of foul play. Hastings observed. Do you suspect someone in particular? Charles hesitated. Guy, I don't know, but something feels wrong about all of this. Hastings glanced toward the door. Poirot is not in the best condition to take on the case, but I can at least bring this to his attention. Tell me where. Were you when the murder happened? Charles's hands tightened into fists. I was in London. I traveled there every week for business, and last night was no exception. My wife's Isabella sent me a telegram early this morning. Hastings leaned forward slightly. And what of the household who was present at the time? My wife, our servant, and of course my Uncle. Hastings nodded, absorbing the details. Tell me, Mr. Cavendish, why do you think your uncle was killed? Did he have any known enemies? Was there any ongoing dispute? Charles sexled. My uncle was a difficult man, ill-tempered, proud, but he was also wealthy. He inherited the family fortune after my parents passed away and moved in with us shortly after. He had a habit of holding his wealth over our heads, reminding us that we were dependent on him. Had there been any recent quarrels? Charles hesitated. There was a disagreement a few days ago, but nothing serious. Hastings nodded again, but noted the flicker of hesitation. Something told him there was more to the story than Charles was letting on. Well, Mr. Cavendish, I shall relate these to Poirot, Hastings said, standing in the meantime. I suggest you remain in London. If we decide to take on the case, I will accompany you back to your estate. Charles stood as well, looking momentary, relieved. Thank you, Captain. Please persuade him. I know he is the only one who can truly solve this. Hastings gave him a reassuring nod before stepping away. His mind already racing. Poirot had solved countless cases, many of them far more complex than this one, but there was something settling in Charles Cavendish, something that did not quite sit right. Walked back to Poirot's bedroom and found the detective resting with his eyes closed. Well, mourn me, Poirot murmured without opening his eyes. You haven't spoken to the visitor? No. Hastings crossed his arms. Yes, his name is Charles Cavendish, and his uncle has been murdered. Poirot's eyes opened just slightly, their green depths sharp despite his fatigue. Ah, he said softly. Now that Hastings is most interesting. Chapter 2. The murder of Sir Reginald Cavendish. Hastings strode back into Poirot's dimly lit bedroom, his mind still processing the anxious words of Charles Cavendish. Poirot remained nestled in his bed, his face partially obscured by the blanket that he had tucked meticulously beneath his chin. Detective's eyes fluttered open as Hastings entered, their sharp gleam betraying an alertness that belied his weakened state. Well, more than me, Poirot murmured, his voice but tinged with curiosity. You have spoken to the visitor? No. Hastings nodded, taking a seat beside the bed. His name is Charles Cavendish. He claims his uncle, Sir Reginald Cavendish, was murdered last night. Poole raised a single, neatly groomed eyebrow. Charles Cavendish, but of course I know the name. He's married to Isabella Monalaire, is he not? Poirot's mustache twitched a slight lithe, smallest hint of intrigue flashing across his face. A rather famous actress, and, if I recall correctly, her mother before her was equally renowned on the stage. And Hastings leaned forward slightly, surprised. Yes, exactly, but how do you? Poirot let out a weary sigh and waved a hand dismissively. Come now, Hastings, you must give me some credit. I make it my business to observe, to remember, to know things that others do not. The more terrifyingly is well known in certain circles, but tell me, what else did this young Cavendish have to say? Hastings hesitated, truckling. The distress etched onto Charles's pale features. He was terribly shaken. Poole, I insisted that the local authorities would bungle the investigation, that his uncle's murder was not some simple burglary gone wrong, but something far more sinister. Poole nodded, thoughtful, falling his hands over his chest. And where was our Monsieur Cavendish when this terrible crime was committed in London? Hastings plied Key visits every week for business this morning. he received a telegram from his wife. "Your uncle has been murdered. Come home at once." That's when he rushed to us. Pooh tapped a finger against his template wife. Since the telegram, there was a long pause before. Poirot sighed heavily and pulled his blanket tighter around himself. "Alas, mon ami, I am not well enough to travel. I cannot go gallivanting across the countryside, even for a murder most intriguing." Hastings blinked. "But pooh, no, I must conserve my strength." Poirot interrupted. "But you, my dear Hastings, you shall go in my place." He guessed Eureka were the writing desk. "Fetch me a notepad. I shall give you instructions." Hastings sighed. No answer. Was no room for argument. He stood, retrieved a notepad and pencil, and handed them to Poirot. The detective took them with a weak smile. "Pan, now listen carefully. When you arrive, you must observe every detail, no matter how small the footprints outside. The house, the manner in which the body was found, the position of the furniture, the state of the room. Nothing must be overlooked." Poirot tapped the pencil against his chin. Hastings jotted everything down. "Understood." Poirot leaned back against his pillows. "Ah, and one more thing. You will send me telegrams, fract ones, every detail. Mon ami, every clue." Hastings folded the notepad and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Right. I won't let you down." Pooh let out a small chuckle, though it was tinged with fatigue. "We shall see, Hastings. We shall see." An hour later, Hastings found himself seated opposite Charles Kendish in a train carriage, bound for the Kendish estate. The rhythmic chug of the locomotive did little to soothe the tension that clung to the air between them. Charles, though appearing slightly more composed than before, continued to fidget, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. "I appreciate you coming with me, Captain Hastings," Charles said, his voice still carrying a tremor. "I know I must seem unsteady. It has been a dreadful morning." Hastings nodded. "Understandable, given the circumstances. I only wish Poirot could hate come himself." Charles managed a weak smile. The Greek detective. "Yes, had hoped to see him in action, but I suppose I'll have to settle for you." Hastings raised an eyebrow. "I'll do my best not to disappoint." Charles sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "This entire situation, it doesn't feel real. My uncle was difficult, but he was a force of nature. Unyielding, stubborn, always in control. And now to think of him lying there." His voice trailed off. Hastings adjusted his posture. "Tell me, Charles, when exactly did you receive that telegram this morning?" "Just before 9, Charles replied. "I had arrived in London yesterday afternoon and had spent the evening at my club. I was due to return home tomorrow, but when Isabella's message arrived, I left at once." Hastings pulled out his notepad, and the telegram simply read, "Your uncle has been murdered. Come home at once." "Yes." Charles exhaled. "I took the first train back. As soon as I arrived at the station, I came straight to Poirot." Hastings studied him for a moment before jotting something down. "Your uncle, Sir Reginald Kendish. Tell me more about him." Charles shifted in his seat. He was not an easy man. He was hot-tempered, difficult to please, but he was also immensely wealthy. After my parents' deed moved into our estate, he was always quick to remind us that we depended on his goodwill. "And were there any recent arguments between you?" Hastings asked. Charles hesitated. "There was some tension a few days ago, but nothing that would." Stood short, his jaw tightening. Hastings watched him closely. "Nothing that would lead to murder." Charles let out a humorous laugh. "You don't know my uncle, Captain Hastings. He had a way of making an M. Hastings tapped his pencil against the page, and who, aside from yourself, Andy, our wife, was living at the estate. The household servant, Mrs. Atkins." Charles answered. The train's whistle blew as it neared their destination. Charles leaned back against seat, his fingers interlaced. "I just need to know the truth, Captain. I need to understand why this happened." Hastings looked out the window as the rolling countryside blurred past. "That's why we're here." Charles to find the truth. As the train slowed, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far more complex than it appeared, and though Poirot was miles away, his presence loomed over Hastings' thoughts. Something about this murder wasn't right, and he intended to find out what. Chapter 3: The House of Secrets. The train pulled into the small country station near the Kendish estate, its brakes screeching in protest as it came to a halt. The afternoon sky hung low with heavy gray clouds, casting a somber mood over the landscape. Hastings stepped onto the platform, adjusting his coat against a chilly wind, while Charles Kendish lingered just behind him, his expression tense. Waiting for them was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a square, jaw-piercing gray eyes. He wore a long overcoat and a hat pulled low over his forehead. His posture was rigid, and there was an unmistakable air of skepticism about him as Hastings and Charles approached. The man smirked. "So the great Hercule Poirot isn't with you?" His tone was laced with sarcasm, her pity. Hastings straightened. "Poirot is unwell," he said curtly, "but I am here on his behalf." Inspector Graves let out a short chuckle. "Well, then let's hop you over. Picked up a thing or two from your famous friend, though. Between you and me, I was looking forward to seeing him in action." Hastings bristled at a dismissive remark, but kept his composure. "I assure you, Inspector, I intend to be just as thorough in my investigation." Graves shrugged. "We'll see about. Then let's get moving." The three men climbed into a waiting motorcar, thinking, rumbling as it carried them down a winding road lined with tall, shadowed trees. As they neared the Kendish estate, Hastings took in the sight before him's house was. A grand old mansion, its dark stone walls rising against the overcast. Sky ivy curled around its edges like creeping fingers, and the whitey-double doors at the entrance looked formidable. The car rolled to a stop, and the driver opened the door for them. Hastings stepped out, adjusting his hot-ass. Charles hesitated for a moment before following the butler. An elderly man with a stern face opened the door as they approached. "Mr. Kendish, welcome home," he said solemnly, stepping aside to allow them entry. Inside the house was heavy with silence. The air carried a faint trace of cigar smoke, an old book cylindering presence of its late occupant. Hastings found himself instinctively lowering his voice as they were led toward the study before they could. A narrow woman appeared in the hallway. She was thin and slightly hunched with age, her hair neatly pinned into a tight bun. Her face was lined, her eyes sunken but sharp. "This is Mrs. Atkins," Charles introduced, "our housekeeper." Hastings regarded her with interest. "Mrs. Atkins, I understand you were the last person to see Sir Reginald alive." She nodded, slowly folding her hands in front of her. "Yes, sir. Last night. Just after 9, a visitor came to see him. A tall man with a long beard. I led him into the study and went to make tea, as Sir Reginald had instructed. I was only gone 10 minutes, but when I returned, I heard a gunshot. Things frowned. And what did you do?" "I ran to the door, but it was locked from inside." Her voice wavered slightly. "I knocked, called for Sir Reginald, but there was no answer then. I noticed the study's window. It was wide open. I looked at him, and she swallowed hard, steadying herself. There was blood everywhere. Sir Reginald was slumped over his desk. He had been shot." A tense silence followed. Hastings scanned a glance with Inspector Graves, who merely raised an eyebrow, and the visitor. Hastings pressed, "Did you see him leave?" Mrs. Atkins shook her head. "No, sir. When I ran to the window there was no sign of him. It was dark outside, and I was too frightened to go out alone." Hastings took a moment to absorb her account, making mental notes of the details. A mysterious visitor, an open window, lock a door. Something felt amiss, and when the servant was gone after a few minutes, a woman entered, moving with an elegance that seemed almost rehearsed. She was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair pinned into soft waves, deep brown eyes, and lips that curled a dento. A knowing smile. She carried herself with a poise that suggested she was no stranger to commanding attention. Isabella Monlaire Kendish. Hastings had seen her photographs before, always poised in the society pages alongside other notable figures of the theater world, but in person she was even more captivating. "I assume you'll interrogate us one by one, Mr. Hastings," she said, her voice smooth, her tone almost amused. Hastings was momentarily taken back. Her confidence was unusual. Most people, when confronted with an investigator, would be at least somewhat anxious, but Isabella seemed entirely at ease, as though this were merely another role she was playing. "I simply wish to ask a few questions, Mrs. Kindish," Hastings replied evenly. "Of course," she said, folding her arms. "I expected nothing less. That is how detectives work, isn't it? Observe, they suspect they unravel secrets." Her lips curled at the corners. "Ito, love a good mystery." Hastings studied her carefully. "Where were you when the gunshot was fired?" Isabella's expression remained composed. "In my room. I was about to retire for the night. When I heard it, I ran downstairs and found Mrs. Atkins standing outside the locked study door." "And what did you do next?" "I sent Miss Atkins to fetch the police." Hastings nodded, glancing at the elderly housekeeper, who remained stiff and silent. "Did you see anything unusual before or after the murder?" Isabella tilted her head, her gaze thoughtful. "Everything about it was unusual, wasn't it? My husband was in London. My uncle-in-law had a mysterious visitor, a gunshot in a locked room." "It all sounds very dramatic." Hastings didn't care for her tone. It was too detached to aware. "Were you fond of Sir Reginald?" he asked. Isabella's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in her eyes. "Fond? That would be a strong word. He was a difficult man, stubborn, controlling, but he was family." A perfectly rehearsed answer, Hastings thought. He turned to Inspector Graves. "We'll need to examine the study." Graves nodded. "Already sealed it off. Deputy has been sent for post-mortem. You can see the room now." Hastings turned back to Isabella. "One last question, Miss Gainish. Did your husband have any disputes with Sir Reginald before his death?" Isabella's smile remained, but it was sharper now. "My husband and his uncle had financial discussions from time to time, but then all families have disagreements, don't they?" Hastings studied her for a moment longer, then turned to follow Graves down the hall. The Candish estate was filled with secrets, and he intended to uncover the mall chapter. For clues in the dark, Hastings stood at the threshold of Sir Reginald Sendis's study, taking in the grim scene before him. The once orderly room, filled with dark wooden bookshelves and expensive furniture, now bore the undeniable marks of violence. The thick Persian carpet beneath the desk was stained a deep crimson. A stark contrast scanned its intricate gold and navy patterns. The heavy oak desk, where Sir Reginald had presumably been seated before his murder, still held an overturned glass, its contents long since soaked into the fibers of the carpet. Inspector Graves stepped forward, gesturing toward the desk. "We found him slumped over right here," he said, "shot in the back of the head. No sign of a struggle." Hastings studied the surroundings, his brow furrowing. "No forced entry, none." Graves confirmed the door was locked from the inside. When we arrived, Hastings glanced toward the window, now slightly ajar. He stepped closer, peering out into the dimly lit garden. Even with the lanterns casting their glow across the grounds, he could see the uneven patches of earth disturbed just outside. He turned back to the inspector. "And this window?" Graves nodded. "Open when we got here. Plenty of footprints in the soil below. Simeon definitely came in or left through there." Hastings stroked his chin. "The servant, Mrs. Atkins, claims Thatch led a visitor into the study, a man with a long beard. She left to make tea, and then heard a gunshot. By the time Sheridan, the door was locked." Graves gestured toward the mantelpiece, where two identical pistols lay side by side. "Two weapons found in the room. One was fired, the other wasn't touched." Hastings picked up one of the pistols, inspecting its weight in his hand. "Well, did these belong to Sir Reginald?" Graves answered. "He kept them in a glass case right over there." He pointed to the wall, where an empty display case, the glass shattered, hung above the bookshelves. Hastings frowned. "And yet, one gun remains unused. Curious, isn't it?" Graves said. "Whoever fired the shot must have deliberately chosen one over the other." Hastings placed the pistol back down carefully. "Where was Charles at the time of the murder?" he asked, turning his attention to Isabella. who had been standing by the doorway watching the conversation unfold with cool detachment. "He left for London at 6 o'clock. She answered smoothly. Hastings studied her face. There was something unnerving about how poised she remained, even in the midst of a murder investigation. "You're certain of the time?" "He absolutely," she replied. "He caught the train at precisely 6 Hastings." Turn it back to Graves. "Did anyone confirm seeing Charles Candish on the train?" "I haven't checked yet," Graves admitted. "But we will." Hastings turned his attention back, tough window crouching to examine the footprints more closely. There were many of them, leading both toward and away from the house. The impressions were deep, suggesting someone had lingered outside. For some time, someone definitely used this window, he muttered, mostly to himself. Graves grunted. "No doubt, but was it the murderer entering or someone escaping after the deed was done?" Hastings straightened, dusting off his shins. "That, Inspector, is what we must determine later that evening." Hastings and Graves made their way to the small hospital where Sir Reginald's body had been taken. The building was dimly lit, sterile scent of disinfectant clinging to the air as they were led down a narrow corridor to the examination room. The doctor, a balding man with thin spectacles, greeted them with a grave nod. "I finished the preliminary examination," he said, gesturing toward the covered body on the table. Hastings took steadying breath as the sheet was drawn back, revealing the still form of Sir Reginald Candish. Even in death, his features were sharp and severe, his gray hair neatly combed, as if he had been prepared for an appointment rather than a burial. "Bullet struck the back of the head," the doctor explained, lifting the man's head slightly to show the small, clean wound. No signs of hesitation. The shot was precise. Hastings examined the wound carefully. The angle suggests the killer was standing directly behind him. "Correct," the doctor said. "The bullet entered cleanly and exited through the front and standing his death." Hastings folded his arms. No other injuries, no sign of a struggle. "None," the doctor confirmed. "Whoever did this caught him completely off guard." Graves sighed. "That suggests one of two things. Either the killer was Simeon he trusted, or someone who was able to take him by surprise." Hastings nodded, his mind already racing ahead. "We need to check the train records for Charles Candish, confirm whether he truly left for London at 6. If he did, when we rule him out as a direct suspect." Graves pulled out his notebook. "In the bearded man, assuming he exists, will need to find out if anyone matching that description was seen at the station." Hastings rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There's another matter that troubles me, the financial background of Charles and Isabella. We need to know what was at stake. If Sir Reginald had power over their money, that could be a motive." Graves nodded. "I'll put in a request for financial records." Hastings glanced at the lifeless form of Sir Reginald one last time for stepping back. "Something about this doesn't add up, Graves," he murmured. "Locked door, the open window, the footprints. It feels as though it was staged to mislead us." Graves smirked. "You're starting to sound like Pua." Hastings let out a dry chuckle. "Well, I have learned from the best." Without wasting another moment, Hastings made his way to the nearest telegraph office. He had much to report. That night, Hastings wired a detailed report to Poirot. Blood-stained carpet, locked studio door, open window, deep footprints. Outside, 2 pistols. One used the other, untouched shit, to the back of the head. No struggle. Charles Candish left for London at 6:00 am. Need confirmation. Witness claims a bearded man visited. No sign of forced entry. Isabella remains eerily composed, checking financial records, requesting quittance. Poirot's response came swiftly. Arrest the servant immediately. You also investigate the bearded man at the station. Check Charles's train records and the couple's financial background. Hastings frowned at the last instruction. Arrest the servant. Had glanced out of his window, watching as the moonlight cast eerie shadows along the grounds of the tombs. Candish, he said to Poirot, must have seen something Hastings had not, and that troubled him more than anything else. Chapter 5, A Vanishing Servant. The next morning, Hastings arrived at the train station determined to verify Charles Kendish's alibi and to gather any information on the mysterious bearded man. Mrs. Atkins had described the station was a modest one with a single ticket booth, a waiting bench, and a few porters tending to the passengers. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of cold, smoke, and damp earth. Hastings approached the station master, a stout man with round spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. He was meticulously going through his ledger when Hastings cleared his throat. "Excuse him, I'm here regarding the events of the night S. Reginald Kendish was murdered." The station master looked up, seeing his spectacles. Yes, sir, I heard about that dreadful business. How can I help? I need to confirm if a man with a long beard was seen at the station that evening," Hastings said, watching the station master carefully for any sign of recognition. The man frowned, adjusting his cap. "A long beard, you say?" "Yes, the household servant claimed such a man visited Sir Reginald that night." The station master shook his head. "No, sir, I didn't recall seeing anyone like that, and I'd have noticed most of our regular travelers are businessmen or locals and shaven for the most part." Hastings felt a prickle of furies. "Are you certain, perhaps, one of your porters saw someone matching that description?" The station master turned and called over a young porter, a lad no older than 20, who had been stacking luggage onto a trolley. "George, this gentleman has a question." The porter wiped his hands on his vest and nodded. "Yes, sir." Hastings repeated the question. The boy frowned, scratching his head. "Can't say. I did, sir. Here weren't many travelers that evening, just the usual folks. If a man with a long beard had been here, I'd have noticed for sure." Hastings nodded slowly. "Thank you." He turned back to the station master. "One more thing I need to confirm, that Charles Cavendish board death 6 p.m. train to London." The station master flipped through his ledger and drawing a finger down the column. "Yes, sir. Here. It is Charles Kendish purchased Isaac for the 6 p.m. train to London and boarded as scheduled." Hastings exhaled, processing this new information. So the bearded man had seemingly never existed, and Charles Kendish had indeed been on the train when the murder took place, and yet something still didn't sit right after leaving the train station. Hastings made his way to the solicitor's office in town to inquire about Sir Reginald Kendish's financial affairs. If Charles and Isabella had a motive beyond personal grievances, it would likely be rooted in money. The office of Finch and Howard was a small but well-kept establishment. Its mahogany counters polished to a shine. A wiry, middle-legged man with a thin mustache and sharp eyes greeted Hastings from behind a desk. "Eom, looking into Sir Reginald Kendish's recent financial dealings," Hastings said, presenting his credentials. The man, Mr. Howard, as his name plate read, nodded. "Yes, tragic affair. His passing, we handled his legal matters for years." "What is it you wish to know?" "I'd like to understand the financial situation of Charles and Isabella Kendish," Hastings said, "particularly whether they had any monetary dependence on Sir Reginald." Howard pursed his lips before flipping open a file. The Kendishes were not in a strong financial position. Charles Kendish had investments that failed, and Isabella's theatrical career had been in decline. Sir Reginald was known to provide financial assistance, though he did so grudgingly. Hastings leaned forward. "Was there anything recent? Any debts outstanding?" Howard hesitated before answering. "Significant ones. Yes, Charles had borrowed large sums from Sir Reginald in the past year, and only last week Sir Reginald had a new will drafted." Hastings felt his pulse quicken. "A new will?" "Yes," Howard confirmed, "but it was never signed." Hastings sat back, his mind working furiously. A new will, debts, and Dunkel, reluctant to part with his money motives, were beginning to take shape with these unsettling revelations in mind. Hastings returned to the Kendish estate, intent on questioning Mrs. Atkins further about her account of the night's events. But upon arriving, he found the household in quiet disarray. He stepped into the drawing room where Isabella sat in a silk dressing gown reading a letter She looked up at him with mild amusement. Back so soon? To Hastings. Hastings ignored her tone. Where? Mrs. Atkins. Isabella frowned. What do you mean she isn't in the house? Hastings said, glancing toward the staircase. She was supposed to be questioned further today. Isabella set her letter aside. She left. Hastings' teeth went. Left where Isabella shrugged. A flicker of something unreadable in her expression. She told the staff she had urgent personal matters to attend to, and simply vanished before breakfast. Hastings narrowed his eyes, without informing the authorities, without completing her statement. I was just as surprised as you are, Isabella said smoothly. Perhaps she was frightened. Not everyone enjoys the company of police officers. Hastings wasn't buying it. Mrs. Atkins had been the only person who had supposedly seen the mysterious, bearded visitor, and now, just as that claim had been cast into doubt, she was gone, determined to get answers. Hastings wasted no time in tracking down the agency through which Isabella had supposedly hired Mrs. Atkins, traveled to a small office in town where a young woman at the front desk greeted him. I need to inquire about a servant who was employed at the Kendish estate. Hastings stated. Mrs. Atkins, the woman, flipped through a ledger. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't see a Mrs. Atkins listed as having been placed at that estate. Hastings frowned. Are you sure? Isabella Kendish claimed. She was hired through your agency. The woman checked again, shook her head. We've sent several staff members to various estates, but no Mrs. Atkins was ever placed at Kendish House. Hastings stared at her for a long moment. Mrs. Atkins didn't just vanish, she had never existed. As he stepped outside, the cold realization settled over him like a thick fog. Poole had been right to be suspicious. This case was far from what Teat appeared to be, and the real mystery was only just beginning. Chapter 6. These event, who never was the night, was bitterly cold, a biting wind sweeping through the countryside as the police scoured the area beyond the Kendish estate. The ground stretched for miles, a mix of thick forest and open fields, with only the occasional flicker of lantern light illuminating the darkness. At last, just beyond the tree, one of the officers called out, "Over here." Inspector Graves and Hastings hurried to the scene, their breath visible in the crisp night air. The constable knelt in the dirt, holding up a pistol. It was half buried beneath fallen leaves. As a vastly discarded. Graves took the weapon carefully, turning it over in his gloved hands. One bullet missing, he noted grimly. Hastings peered over his shoulder. The murder weapon. Graves nodded. Looks like it. Found 4 miles from the house, just as we suspected. He turned to Hastings with a self-satisfied expression. This confirms our theory. The servant killed Sir Reginald and fled, discarding the weapon to cover her tracks. Hastings crossed his arms, nodding. In agreement. It makes sense. She was the only person unaccounted for, or the only one who claimed to have seen this so-called bearded visitor. And now she's gone. There's no doubt in my mind she must be the killer. Graves exhaled sharply. Will circulate a description, though, with no real records of her employment. Tracking her down will be difficult. Perhaps she changed her name, or she was using an alias all along, Hastings suggested. Regardless, she's the only one who could have pulled this off. With the discovery of the gun, Hastings felt a surge of triumph. He hadn't it. He had solved the case, or so he thought by the time Hastings returned to Poirot's lodgings the next morning. He was brimming with confidence. He wasted no time recounting the events of the night, emphasizing the discovery of the gun and how it aligned perfectly with the theory that the missing servant had been the murderer. It was the servant. Cora Hastings declared she vanished after committing the murder, clear as day. No records of her exist, and now we found the gun she discarded in her escape. Poirot, still seated in bed with a warm blanket wrapped around his small frame, regarded Hastings with a wary expression. Then, with a deep sigh, he shook his head. Hastings, mon ami, you continued to disappoint me. Hastings blinked toward Poirot, leaned forward slightly. The servant never existed. Hastings froze, a chill running down his spine. But, Poirot, That's impossible. We all saw her. She was in the house. She spoke to the police. Poirot gave him a pitying look. And yet you now know that no agency ever placed her at the Kindish estate. No one actually remembers hiring her. Tell me, Hastings, when you arrived at the house, did the servant and Madame Isabella peer together? Hastings opened his mouth to answer, but faltered. He thought back number he had first spoken to Mrs. Atkins, and then much later. Isabella had entered the room, but at no point had they stood side by side. Poirot read their realization in Hastings' face. You see now? Yes, this so-called Mrs. Atkins was a fabrication, a character created for a singular purpose. Hastings palled. Then he was. Poirot smiled, though there was no amusement in it. At Mon Ami is a true mystery, Chapter 7, Poirot's deduction. Hastings sat across from Poirot, still reeling from the detective's quiet but cutting words. The servant never existed. It made no sense. How could she not exist? He had spoken to her. She had answered. His questions recounted the events of the murder, and it even led him through the tragic details of Sir Reginald's final moments. Yet now, Poirot was telling him that she had simply vanished because she had never been real in the first place. Hastings frowned, but Poirot, that's impossible. She was there. She was in the house. She spoke. With me, with the inspector. We all saw her. Poirot gave him a knowing look, and then asked, Tell me, mon ami, when you arrived at the house, did you see the servant and Madame Isabella together? Hastings opened his mouth to reply, but faltered a thought. Back carefully, he had first spoken to Mrs. Atkins, the elderly housekeeper. She had been waiting in the drawing room, looking frail, but composed. Had told him about the bearded visitor and described how she had gone to make tea just before the murder took place. Later, much later, Isabella had entered the room, moving with that poised, almost theatrical grace, but at no point had the two of them stood together. Poirot's eyes sparkled with satisfaction as he watched Hastings' face slowly shift from confusion to dawning realization. No, Hastings murmured. Now that you mention it, I didn't. Poirot clasped his hands together. Voila. Hastings, that is the key. Hastings swallowed. But if Miss Atkins wasn't real, who was she? Poirot leaned back against his pillows, highest expression triumphant. She was Isabella Kindish. Hastings gasped. You mean Poole? Nodded the wife of Charles. Kindish, a woman of great beauty, yes, but also a woman of immense talent. Do not forget. Hastings Isabella is an actress, and not just any actress, but one with years of stage experience. It would be nothing for her to alter her posture, change her voice, and transform herself into a frail old servant. She created the role, played it to its perfection, and then, when the time was right, she vanished. Hastings felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He was astounded, and yet the more he considered it, the more the pieces fell into place. But why? He asked. Why would she go through all that trouble? Coup gave him a small smile. Thank Hastings, who benefited from Sir Reginald's death. Hastings frowned, considering it. Charles and Isabella persistently, Poirot said, and as you yourself discovered, Charles and Isabella were in a dire financial situation, sir. Reginald was wealthy, yes, but he was also controlling. He held the purse strings, and if they wanted any of his fortune, they would have to wait for him to take matters into their own hands. Hastings sat back in his chair. So Isabella created the character of Mrs. Atkins to act as a witness. Poirot Tacitus, Temple Treba. She needed to provide an account of the murder that would lead suspicion away from herself. And what better way to do that than by playing the part of the loyal servant, a harmless old woman who could direct suspicion onto an imaginary, bearded man. Hastings shuddered. It was all an act, of course, Poirot said, but Isabella did not act Alanino. This was a crime committed by both husband and wife. Hastings leaned forward. You mean child was involved from the beginning? Poirot nodded. Oui, mon ami. It was planned down to the finest detail. He steepled his fingers and began his explanation. Charles left for London at precisely 6 o'clock, making certain he was seen boarding train This was his alibi, but before he left, he took one of Sir Reginald's pistols and walked some distance from the house there. He fired a single shot into the ground and discarded the weapon that way. If anyone heard a shot before the murder took place, they might assume it was all part of the same incident. Hastings's eyes widened, so the gun found in the woods wasn't the murder weapon at all. No, Poe confirmed it was a decoy. Meanwhile, Isabella remained at the house, waiting for the right moment. That evening, she transformed herself into these events. She played the role convincingly, going about the house and assuring she was seen. Then, at precisely 900 p.m., she carried out the murder herself. She took the real gunshots, original in the back of the head, and placed the weapon back where it belonged. Then, she locked the door from the inside, left through the open window, removed her disguise, and returned. As herself, to discover the crime, Hastings exhaled slowly, his heart racing, and she sent the telegram to Charles, telling him the deed was Donisac Poirot. Said he arrived back at the estate, pretending to know nothing, concerning that all eyes were on the missing servant rather than himself or his wife. Hastings ran a hand through his hair, and it almost worked. Puzzled, almost, Hastings let out a low whistle. They planned it all so perfectly. First suspicion would fall on the bearded visitor, who never existed. Then, when that thread unraveled, all attention would turn to the missing servant, who also never existed. It was all disingnito. Create confusion. Poole nodded. Indeed, mon ami, it was a performance worthy of the stage, but as always, the truth cannot remain hidden forever. Hastings felt his admiration for Poole grow tenfold. The sheer brilliance of the deduction, the way he had unraveled the deception. It was astounding, but there was one lingering question. What now? Hastings asked. How do we prove each? Chapter 8. Justice finds a way. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting a warm glow across the sitting room. Pajot sat comfortably in his chair, sipping his tea, while Hastings paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression clouded with frustration. The case had concluded, yet its resolution left him with an unshakable sense of failure. I still can't believe it, Poole, Hastings muttered, shaking his head. We knew they were guilty. We had every reason to suspect them, and yet they walked free. Poirot washed an eyebrow and delicately placed his teacup onto its saucer. You are too harsh on yourself, mon ami. The world does not always function in the neat and tidy way you desire. But tell me, what troubles you the most? That they were not arrested, or that you feel you have failed in my absence? Hastings stopped his pacing and exhaled heavily. Both, I suppose. He sank into the chair opposite Poirot, rubbing his temples. We had the truth, Poirot. We uncovered their deception. Their motive is their entire scheme, and yet, without solid proof, without an eyewitness or a confession, we had nothing. It was infuriating. Hastings, you are learning, but let me tell you something. Justice is not always swift. It is not always served by the hands of the law. But justice, Smontier, is patient, and it finds a way. Hastings sighed. Sats. It's easy for you to say. You always seem to know how these things will end. Poirot chuckled. Not always, Hastings, but I do have faith in the balance of the word, and so should you. Hastings frowned, but said nothing's frustration still lingered, and though Poirot's words carried wisdom, they were not yet enough to ease his conscience. 2 months later, it was a rainy afternoon when the news arrived. Hastings sat by the window of their London apartment, watching the streets below as people hurried along unrelentingly under the relentless downpour. Poirot was at his usual place, methodically arranging his breakfast tray, ensuring everything was in perfect order before he began his meal. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their morning ritual. Hastings stood and opened it to find delivery boy holding a newspaper, its pages slightly damp from the weather. Hastings took it, muttering "Aquic, thank you," before flipping it open. As he returned to his chair, high sighs scanned the headlines, then suddenly stopped. A chill ran through him as he read the words printed in bold letters. Tragic car accident, claims lives of Charles and Isabella Candish. His hands tightened around the edges of the newspaper. His heart pounded Poirot. He began, his voice uncertain. Poirot calmly stirred a spoonful of sugar into his tea. Mon ami, what shocking news do you bring this morning? Hastings laid the newspaper on the table between them, pointing to Thirticle. It's them. It's Poirot, Charles, and Isabella. They're dead. Poole merely raised an eyebrow and took a slow sip of his tea. Is that so? Hastings read aloud, his voice tinged with disbelief. Late last evening, Charles and Isabella Candish were involved in a tragic automobile accident on the winding roads outside of Brighton. Their vehicle skidded off the road during heavy rainfall and overturned in a ditch. Both passengers were killed instantly. Authorities suspect the car was traveling at a high speed, and the poor weather conditions may have contributed to the crash. No other vehicles were involved. Poole shrugged. It was inevitable. They believed themselves to be clever, but the guilt, crime, is a heavy burden to bear. Perhaps the strain of keeping up the deception was too much for them. Perhaps, with their newfound freedom, they grew reckless. Or Hastings. Perhaps it was simply a matter of fate. Hastings exhaled, staring at the rain streaking against the window. Do you really believe that? Tira's mustache twitched slightly. I believe, mon ami, that one does not cheat justice. You may delay it, you may deceive others, but sooner or later it arrives. Hastings shook his head, still trying to process it all. So in the end, they got what they deserved. Poirot lifted his cup in a small toast. Nature has its way, Hastings. The scales must always balance. A long silence followed. Hastings watched us. Poirot finished his tea, seemingly unaffected by the dramatic turn of events. Katie, the truth was there unspoken bitterness between them. Poirot had known all along. He had seen past the immediate frustration of the case slipping through the legal system and had trusted that justice in its own way would be served. Hastings folded the newspaper and set it aside. His frustration, which had weighed in him for weeks, slowly began to fade. The outcome was not one that he had anticipated, but it was an outcome nonetheless. He looked at Poirot, who was now straightening his breakfast tray with his usual meticulous care. You know, Poirot, Hastings said with a small smile, sometimes I wonder if you don't have a direct line to fate yourself. Poirot smirked. Ah, mon cher Hastings, if only that were true. But alas, I am merely a humble detective. He winked. A detective who happens to know fade patience. Observation and a little faith will always reveal the truth. Hastings chuckled, shaking his head. He picked up his own cup of tea and took a sip. Through arm spreading through him. Yes, Poirot, he murmured. It's certainly diabolic. The curtain falls. The streets of London were alive with the usual bustle of morning activity. Carriages rolled past, the clop of hooves against cobblestone blending with the chatter of passers-by and the distant calls of newspaper vendors hawking the day's headliness inside their cozy apartment. All Poirot sat at his desk, meticulously organizing his notes from the Candish case. Each detail was recorded with precision, as if he were arranging the final pieces of a grand puzzle, one that had already been solved, yet demanded to be preserved for posterity. Across from him, Captain Hastings leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window with a contemplative expression. The case had long since concluded, yet it still lingered in his house. What are you thinking there? Poirot asked, without looking up. Hastings eyed. I suppose, just trying to understand how I feel about it all. Poole smiled knowingly. And what have you concluded? Hastings turned to face him. That justice was served in a way, but it wasn't by our hand, or by the law. I expected a trial, a confession, something concrete. Instead, they met their fate on a rain-slicked road, and the case closed itself. Poirot clasped his hands together. Hastings, you are still bound by your sense of English fairness, wish for justice to be delivered in an orderly fashion, neatly packaged, with a guilty party standing before a judge. But life, mon ami, is not so accommodating. Hastings nodded slowly. I suppose you're right still. I can't help but wonder, did they know Poirot? raised an eyebrow, know what that justice was coming for them. Hastings mused, did they sense it? Did they fear it? Or did they truly believe? They had gotten away with murder right. Until the moment their car left the road, Poole tapped a finger against his chin. A fascinating question, but in the end, it does not matter whether they realized it or not. Justice found them all the same. Hastings exhaled then, straightened in his chair. And what about us, Poirot? What's next? Poirot chuckled, placing his notebook in a drawer and locking it with a small key. I'm on him. The world is full of mysteries waiting to be unraveled, but for now, we rest, let the criminals of the world tremble for. Hercule Poirot remains ever watchful. Hastings laughed, and ever dramatic Poirot smirked. But of course, as the morning light streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the room, Hastings finally felt a sense of closure. The case of the Vanishing Servant had ended, not in a courtroom, but in fate's own way. And though it had not unfolded as he had expected, he knew what. Poirot had always known justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way. And so, with the last page of the case turned, the two men sat in companionable silence, awaiting whatever mystery the world would present to them next.